All right, thanks for that great introduction, Chloe. Really appreciate it. And so this talk is called Playful Occultism, the Ludic and Illusory Attitude in Magical Practice. This is a kind of an iteration and an expansion of a seminar talk that I did out at Malmö University in Sweden. This talk is based on a book proposal that kind of got that out there in the wild with a publisher at the moment about a concept that I call Playful Occultism. And I'm Dr. Jeff Howard, as Chloe said. I'm Associate Professor of Games and Culture at Falmouth University. When it comes to esotericism, I specialize kind of in the Typhonian tradition, which is Kenneth Grant, as it intersects with the sabbatic craft of Andrew Chumbley, who was a traditional witchcraft guy, which means, as we'll see, that I think a lot about being and non-being. And I have the books that Chloe was kind enough to mention. There's Game Magic over there, a book about quest design in the middle called Quest, that's in its second edition. I've got my own law, which is Howard's Law of Occult Game Design, which we'll talk about as we go. I do some work for a studio called Apocalypse Studios. We're working on a game called Dead House Sonata, which is an action RPG where you play the undead fighting against the living. And this is sort of an outline of the way this talk is going to go. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sort of jump into it. So first let's talk about the word occult. The primary sense in which I'm using the word occult is hidden, which is derived from the etymological roots of the word. So we could go all the way back to the Oxford English Dictionary, which outlines the etymological roots of that word, like where it comes from, as coming from the classical Latin oculare, secret, hidden from the understanding, concealed, the past participle of oculare, to cover up, hide, conceal. The same dictionary entry defines the word as meaning of or relating to magic, alchemy, astrology, theosophy, or other practical arts held to involve agencies of a secret or mysterious nature, of the nature of such an art dealing with or versed in such matters, magical. Which brings us to the notion of a culture. And so the word occulture, of course, is a portmanteau in classic Lewis Carroll fashion, where we're sort of smashing together the words occult and culture. Coined by Genesis P. Ulrich, so going all the way back to the Temple of Psychic Youth and Throbbing Gristle and all of that, and popularized by Carl Abramson, and then sort of cascading down into scholarly discourse through notably Christopher Partridge and Egil Asprem. The topic of this talk can be visualized as an infinity sign, that classic image that you see above the head of the magician in the Rider-Waite tarot deck. The left loop, what I think would be your left, is the first one I'll talk about, and that's the influence of the occult on games. The right loop, the second one I'll talk about, is about occult practice as playful. And there's also kind of a space at the intersection of those two loops where occult practice and game playing overlap, and that's what I'm calling playful occultism. Many games are influenced by the occult, often at the level of narrative and mechanics. Games also include mechanics and rules for simulating magic, sometimes referred to as magic systems, which was the topic of my second book, Game Magic. At the same time, there's at least two generations of tabletop designers who have, in contrarian fashion, treated the occult accusations against tabletop role-playing games during the Satanic Panic as an aspirational challenge, almost a dare, using tabletop games as vehicles for representing and simulating occultism, as well as, in the case of the Book of Antitheses, which is here in the lower right-hand corner, using games as a medium for occult practice. And there's various scholars who've kind of written about this. So we've got Laycock in his book Dangerous Games, which is all about kind of tabletop games and the Satanic Panic. Also my friend Eric Alstad, who is a Swedish religious studies scholar, he's looking in particular at the Swedish game Kult, which is a kind of Gnostic left-hand path game. But actually, if we go from left to right, we have Cabal up at what would be your upper left, a French independent role-playing game fusing fin de siècle occultism with William S. Burroughs-style cut-up psychedelia. Invisible Sun, there's the logo in the middle, and actually there was just a Kickstarter for an expansion of the Invisible Sun. But what that is, it's a vast multimodal magic system consisting of lovingly crafted objects and an unmarked black cube that unfolds like a lament configuration. So literally, if you back this Kickstarter at the very beginning, the only tier that you could sort of back was summon the black cube. And I did this, right? So I ordered it, and then like a year and a half later, this big, heavy black cube arrives on my doorstep. And I pick the thing up, and all of a sudden it starts unfolding, and it's got all these like boxes, and it really is sort of like the lament configuration with different kind of books and tchotchkes and a big six-fingered hand that's in the middle of it. But if we keep going, we get Seekers Beyond the Shroud, a single-player journaling RPG based on elaborate ritual correspondences. Cool, which I mentioned as an RPG adaptation of this existentialist Gnosticism inflected through left-hand path practices. Abyss of Hallucinations right in the middle, which is an RPG scenario based on Crowley's Book of Lies. And the Book of Antitheses, an RPG supplement that treats the satanic panics accusations of RPGs as gateways into occult practice, as if they were literally true. As a case study, consider Seekers Beyond the Shroud, in which a player who's doing this kind of single-player journaling game must attend to the magical correspondences of real-world day and time, along with associated harmonious use of the proper incense, color, metal, and gemstone. Indeed, the table found in Crowley's Lever 777, which is on your right there, and Stephen Skinner's Complete Magician's tables, sort of directly resemble that. One is derived from the other. The game, kind of comes from that sort of system of hermetic magic. As the player engages in solitary, rule-based visualization of narrative scenarios associated with these rituals, including the acquisition and outfitting of a magical sanctum, astral projection from the sanctum, and encounters with otherworldly entities, the player chronicles these emergent narratives in a journal, and the line blurs between pretending to do these practices and actually engaging in the practices of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which include the development of a magical temple, the projection into those astral temples, and the evocation or invocation of astral entities. At a certain point, a variation of Arthur C. Clarke's oft-quoted maxim emerges. Just as any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, so any sufficiently advanced simulation of ritual can function as ritual. This is unsurprising, given associations between game playing and magic that originate in the work of the first scholar of modern game studies, Johann Huizinga, and his concept of the magic circle as expressed in Homo Ludens. Huizinga's concept of the magic circle, a boundary around the game that changes the value and significance of what is inside it, is analogous to and based on the magician's magic circle in ceremonial magic, which operates as a barrier protecting the magician from demons. Huizinga writes, just as there is no formal difference between play and ritual, as the consecrated spot cannot be formally distinguished from the playground. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc., are all in form and function playgrounds, i.e. forbidden spots, in isolated, hedged round, hallowed, within which special rules obtain all our temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. So the classic kind of image here is the idea that if I just randomly go out and kind of kick a ball, or even kick a ball into a net, nothing happens. I just look sort of silly because I'm not good at it. But if I do that in like Twickenham Arena, in the middle of, a really tense game of football, then maybe I've scored a goal because I exist inside of that magic circle and everybody cheers, and that would be really wonderful. And so games in general have that kind of resemblance to magic through the magic circle. But there's certain kinds of games that do a little more than that, in that they end up sort of being about shifting states of consciousness, shifting through different sort of planes of existence, through planar travel, which is, after all, a form of metaphysical voyaging derived from the concept of astral projection as present in the Theosophy of H.P. Blavatsky, the ceremonial magic of Golden Dawn, and later Aleister Crowley's practice of rising on the plains in Liber O. So, for all of the kind of defenses against the satanic panic that Gary Gygax and the folks involved in D&D sort of did, they would kind of say, well, we're not basing any of this on kind of occult lore, but then we look at concepts like astral projection or the silver cord or the severing of the silver cord, and we know that comes right out of Theosophy, and Gygax admits as much in his book Master of the Game, which is supposed to tell you how to be a dungeon master, but if you flip through the back of it in the recommended reading, he has encyclopedias of Theosophy, from which those concepts are sort of clearly derived. And they're also kind of derived from Doctor Strange comic books, Steve Ditko, this idea of the sorcerer kind of moving out into these alternate planes of existence. And of course, Ditko was an aficionado of both psychedelics and Tibetan mysticism, where there's an ambiguity as to whether these other worlds are internal states of consciousness, extra-dimensional realms, or both. So what we're dealing with then are games that are in some cases about performing rituals that are sufficiently multimodal and intricate. This is an image of all the stuff you get in that Invisible Sun game. There's so much intricacy to the imagined performance of ritual and to the shift in consciousness that it's supposed to evoke that it starts tipping over into being kind of actual ritual. And the thing about it is, I want to emphasize that although games and ritual are deeply intertwined, not all ludic magic needs to involve elaborate ritual correspondences in the Hermetic tradition. Some forms of gameplay may be more closely aligned with shamanic traditions of altering consciousness, famously formulated by Mircea Eliade as archaic techniques of ecstasy. So that's more the kind of sorceress or shamanic approach that the chaos magician Pete Carroll would talk about. One of the points that Austin Osman Spare makes is that in order to charge a sigil and to kind of invest it with magical energy, what we're trying to do is enter into a kind of state of mental vacuity, a trance state, and he emphasizes that a lot of things could induce that trance state. So choose the most pleasant, writes Austin Osman Spare in the Book of Pleasure. These should be held in favor: mantras and posture, women and wine, tennis, and the playing of patience. So going all the way back to Osman Spare, he had this idea that you could use the playing of solitaire to induce that kind of, that Gnostic state. And so increasingly, the more I thought about this stuff and the kinds of games that kind of resonate with it, I started trying to formulate things as a law. And the notion that I kind of came to in thinking about how to create games which resonate with a sense of hidden depth and mysterious agencies kind of running through them. Well, in the 2014 Game Developers Conference talk in Austin, Texas, I proposed a principle that I referred to as Howard's Law of Occult Game Design. It was later published in this book, which is 100 Principles of Game Design. And what I said is that the power of secret significance is directly proportional to seeming innocence and simplicity. I was referring to games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, in which a seemingly straightforward ending turns out to be false. You think you finished the game, and a seemingly arbitrary yet deeply rule-based sequence of actions reveals an inverted castle. So you actually turn the entire castle upside down and explore this other story, and there was all of this stuff kind of lurking underneath the surface that could have been missed. But I was also thinking about indie game developer Jason Rohrer's Passage, which is the one over there on the right, which, like many indie games of the period, presents itself on its surface as a simple 8-bit walking simulator, but is in fact a deep and poignant autobiographical narrative about the trade-offs of romantic relationships against the backdrop of the artistic tradition of the memento mori. Occult games, in the sense that I am using them, are games with hidden thematic depth. And in this sense, Rohrer's Passage, which is on the right, is even more occult than his Cordial Minuet. So Cordial Minuet, which is on the left, is an anagram of demonic ritual. And as you can see, it has actual magic circles from the grimoires and all this kind of thing. And it's sort of it was like an online gambling game in which you bet real money and this sort of thing. And so it definitely resonated with themes of taking risks and potentially giving away your soul and all of that kind of thing. But it just did not have the degree of thematic depth that is lurking below Passage, which you can kind of play and you look at it and it's like, oh my god, that looks like an Atari game. And then you start to kind of play it and you realize, oh my god, this is like this autobiographical thing about Rohrer's relationship to his partner who was ill at the time and the kind of trade-offs that were happening in their lives because they'd chosen to be together. And there's just this feeling when you play Passage that, it's like gazing at kind of the placid surface of a lake and then realizing, oh my god, that goes thousands and thousands of meters below. And that's what I mean by occult game design. And I realized over time that Howard's Law and its accompanying sense of occult game design were pretty close to what Doris Rush calls a deep game in her book of the title, Making Deep Games. According to Rush, deep games are games with meaning and purpose that express a personal experience through what she calls experiential metaphor. Experiential metaphor is metaphor conceived of as an abstract structure, but experienced concretely through gameplay, also known as experiential gestalt, a term further developed by Rush's mentee at the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab, Jason Beggy. I think it's important to note at this point that Doris Rush not coincidentally identifies as a witch and sees her witchcraft as related to her therapeutic practice, which is in turn related to her practice of game design. Which brings us to, okay, I think I'm making okay time. I'm glancing over at my phone to make sure that we're okay. I've got like 28 minutes left, so I'm cool. This brings us to part 2 of the talk. So this would be kind of entering that second loop, the right loop, the loop where we've thought about games that are in some way occult. Now let's think about occultism that is in some way playful. The presence of games that are occult, both in influence and an underlying structure, opens up the possibility of occult practice itself operating as a form of play. Such an approach is made possible by the existence of early game scholars such as Johann Huizinga, who we've mentioned, and sociologist Roger Calois, who understood play as being fundamental to human behavior and culture. Both of these scholars, who wrote in the early to mid-20th century, and therefore before the advent of video games, saw play as exemplified in games but not limited to them. So we get this notion of the ludic, the idea that, ludic or playful elements can be found in just about any sector of human culture. I think it's especially important to note that P.L. Berger, who's saying that, Peter Berger was a religious studies scholar, and he was specifically thinking about the role of the supernatural as it was sort of played out in modern and postmodern life. But speaking of Roger Calois, and Calois' notion that play runs through human culture, one of the things that Calois does is he lays out sort of 4 types of play. These are 4 types of play, and we're going to see them running through the different occult traditions that I'm going to mention in this part of the talk. One of them is agon. So agon is conflict, and conflict would be, I often think about it as 2 boxers, right? So 2 people are in conflict, and one of them is trying to defeat the other. Or alea, from which we get the word aleatory. So games of chance, games that are about gambling, throwing dice, shuffling cards, that sort of thing. Games of mimesis, and mimesis being sort of make-believe. So charades, any form of role-playing, bless you. And e-links or vertigo games, which are going to come back quite a bit toward the end of this talk. But a vertigo game is a game in which a pleasing sense of dizziness or disorientation is deliberately induced. So think about, children and the way that they'll turn in circles to make themselves dizzy, sometimes before games like Blind Man's Buff, sort of classic folk games. And so if we have those 4 types of play kind of in mind, we can see just how deeply magic and games are intertwined. That's especially true in non-digital games, such as board games and card games, which are contemporaneous with historical origins of magic and were sometimes invested with magical symbolism and significance by ancient cultures. So lots of archaeologists have talked about the idea that the first dice are knuckle bones, sometimes called astrogali or tali, And those are often found in caches near temples, and the thought is that they were sort of used in divination. Or, I mean, we could sort of think about our modern D20, which is itself one of the Platonic solids that are part of the mystical cosmology of Pythagoras, which first appeared as a mysterious Greek die inscribed with Coptic characters, so kind of Hellenistic Egyptian alphabetic characters. And we know that this was used in divination in conjunction with at least one spell in the PGM, the Period Great by Magica. So you would kind of roll the dice and you would look at the number, and that would indicate whether we're going to summon Anubis or Isis or some variation of that. Or, of course, tarot, which begins as a set of card games, including Taroki, and only later acquires the layers of mystical significance associated in divination, when figures like Antoine Coeur de Gébelin argue that the cards represented mysteries or arcana of the Book of Thoth. Or for that matter, we can think about the Enochian chess of the Golden Dawn, a four-handed variant of chess played by the 19th century Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which operates as a nexus between games intended for entertainment and deep games with a spiritual intent. Indeed, MacGregor Mathers and his wife Moina Mathers and W.B. Yeats were known to have played Enochian chess with a fourth invisible spirit partner. Enochian chess was developed by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn as a form of initiatory training and later a method of divination, especially if one or more of the players is disembodied. In each of these cases, play is a sacred activity of the gods, a mode of achieving spirit contact, or both. And in some ways, then, Enochian chess is like a realization of this thing that Hermann Hesse was dreaming about in his book, The Glass Bead Game, or Magister Ludi, in which he imagined this kind of game, originally played with dice, but later with magical lantern slides, which I guess are basically PowerPoint slides. But he envisions this game that weaves together, secret and hidden connections between all fields of human knowledge. And indeed, occultists like Aleister Crowley, and in particular Crowley, who was chess obsessed and sort of a chess master, saw his early experiences as a virtuosic chess player, able to play multiple separate games of chess simultaneously while blindfolded, as preparatory for his ability to visualize astral temples as a part of his training in ceremonial magic. And there's a quotation from his Confessions where he sort of talks about this process. In keeping with the structural and functional relationship between games and occultism, foundational chaos magic magician Lionel Snell, who sometimes writes under the pen name Ramsey Dukes, suggests in his autobiographical Summa, My Years of Magical Thinking, that all sorcerers operate in an aspect of reality called the games layer, a mindset or metaphysical realm of flexible, fluid pattern making outside of any Platonizing understanding of reality. Snell thus argues that all magical practice, including systems of divination, are approached by a skillful sorcerer as games, i.e., arbitrary symbol systems constituting working myths that are nevertheless strictly adopted and followed in much the same way that a player of chess follows its arbitrary rules because they are well balanced and functional within a long history of play. And this is a quotation from Snell kind of talking about the games layer, and that idea that a magician may be operating sort of very seriously within a particular framework or paradigm, but the trick is to understand that the rules of that paradigm, the symbols of that paradigm, are arbitrary, and it is therefore possible to shift into something else if you need to for purposes of adaptation and survival, which is what Snell ultimately thinks magic is sort of all about. Snell's games layer, while Snell does not cite any game studies scholars to support this analogy, the mindset he's describing resembles the illusory attitude, as described by philosopher Bernard Suits in the Grasshopper Games Life in Utopia. In a famous attempt to define games, Suits writes, to play a game is to attempt to achieve a specific set of affairs using only means permitted by rules, where the rules prohibit use of more efficient means in favor of less efficient means, and where the rules are accepted just because they make possible such an activity. Snell's games layer suits illusory attitude, and the related framework of ludic activity suggests that play can serve a crucial function in magic. Play channels and directs energy according to rules, while also leaving room for spontaneity, something that can easily disappear when bound by ceremonial magic, particularly by something like Thelema, with its emphasis on an athletic straining toward change through will. So Crowley, immediately after talking about how chess has prepared him to be a powerful magician, also, ever the competitive athlete, boasts of his ascent of mountains and follows up his analogies between his prodigious chess performance and his ability to visualize astral temples with a boast that his nightly invocation of his holy guardian angel was so intense that a single half hour of magical practice was equal to 30 hours of a sauna. Right? So the thing about Crowley is that he plays, but he's always playing in that agonistic way. If we were to go back to Calwa, he's always playing in a way that's kind of confrontational and athletic and about overcoming the world and the people around him. And sort of in contrast, magical practice becomes playful when it acknowledges spontaneous and unexpected intrusions from ontological realms beyond this one, outside of any willed intent or expectation of result. So Kenneth Grant, initially Crowley's young disciple and later the founder of his own Typhonian tradition, arrives at a different position from Crowley's often dour and puritanical dictum of true will. Late in his 9-volume Typhonian trilogies, Grant formulates the notion of a tangential tantrum, which he defines punningly and playfully as a sudden and obliquely manifested oracle or transmission received, often unexpectedly, outside normal ritual procedure. Such an occurrence can almost only be described as a tangent, i.e. a digressive anecdote, seemingly unrelated and tangential to the carefully regulated linear ritual being described. A tantrum is also tangential in the geometrical sense, i.e. going off at an oblique angle. Similarly, a tantrum exists in the punning sense of a childish fit, disrupting the decorum of a stately ceremonial working. Grant's tangential tantra are made possible because his approach to magic allows room for and even privileges spontaneous occurrences within the framework of ritual. For Grant in his later years, magic is not straining toward change and conformity with will, but allowing magic to manifest spontaneously through tangential tantra, through openness toward disruptively revealing synchronicities. Magic for Grant is not a linear shot, but a ricochet effect, and he explicitly uses that analogy, which is a phrase that also suggests the spontaneous and unexpected movement of a billiard ball or a pinball as it moves between bumpers. And it's important to note that although Grant's ceremonial predecessors put a lot of emphasis on the magic circle and making sure that nothing demonic or dark kind of moves through it, Grant, because of his interest in tangential tantra and these kind of spontaneous disruptions, is very, very interested in the way that the magic circle breaks down. And in fact, he's sort of obsessed with the ways in which an alternate universe, which he calls Universe B, can work its way into our universe, Universe A, through these kind of cracks or portal in reality. And Grant is especially preoccupied with fiction. And he's interested in the idea of using fiction to describe non-existent things as real, such that they become real, such as they manifest. But there's also kind of lurking underneath his preoccupation with fiction, the notion that if fiction is to describe non-existent things as real, then play is to act as if non-existent things are real, and in the process, to allow them to kind of enter into our universe. And Grant is always thinking about this through metaphors of sex magic. He's preoccupied with menstruation and the bloody vagina as kind of a portal of Da'ath I always say when I put this slide in, this is my favorite slide in any PowerPoint presentation that I ever give, so I have to read this. He said, the I as Naya is the eye reversed, not the eye of light, but the eye of the dark, the occult eye, the vulva in its negative phase, the witch moon of blood, the lunar eclipse. So whereas Da'af, that broken place on the tree of life, is sort of something to be transcended or potentially avoided in the preceding ceremonial systems, Grant is about allowing bleed through from one universe to another through Da'af. And there are analogies here because in the tradition of Nordic LARPing or Jeep form, the notion of the magic circle breaking down and concerns from the real world sort of seeping their way into the tabletop game or vice versa, that is referred to as bleed. So there's something going on there about bleeding between the two worlds. Yes, but I want to look at one more magician who's also operating in that kind of left-hand path space, who's also preoccupied with bleed and the allowing forces of non-being in from the other side. And that would be Andrew Chumbley from the cultist Sabbatai. So the cultist Sabbatai was ostensibly a movement of traditional witchcraft, but Andrew Chumbley wove together strands from sort of syncretically from a lot of different traditions, the Sufi tradition, Islamic mysticism, the left-hand path of Hindu Tantra, various traditions of voodoo, Gnosticism. He crafted sabbatic craft as kind of a deep game in the sense that some of those rituals can be quite simple. In the cult of Sabbatai, maybe just looking at a candle and reciting something, and then doing this kind of leftward turn and sort of walking away from the candle. But what Chumbley happens to him as he sort of works is he moves from an early framework of elaborate syncretic ceremonial witchcraft into an increasing emphasis on spontaneous and intuitive spirit contact. Chumbley's rituals are deep games, experiential metaphors that operate through Kalawa's framework of ilinks. I promised that we would come back to this idea of ilinks. So when Kalawa, the game studies scholar, is trying to explain these games of deliberate disorientation and the way that they can provoke changes in consciousness by spinning around, he explicitly references the whirling dervishes. He references the idea that the Sufis turn round and round and round like this in order to kind of pull their consciousness away from mundane reality and to pull it into this kind of whirlpool. So ilinx means whirlpool in ancient Greek. And so while Kalawa comes at that from a game studies perspective, Andrew Chumbley comes at it from a Sufi mystical perspective. So in his description of his mystical poem, Kitab, which means the point, he says that Kitab operates within, and I quote, the Widdershins whirling of the Sufis, with Widdershins movement being that counterclockwise movement, that movement against nature and universe B in order to bring something else. And so there's almost an explicit recognition, although Chumbley isn't quite quoting the kind of game study stuff, but there's a structural similarity between the way that disorientation and playful disorientation and disorientation that goes against the opposing order invites changes of consciousness and contact with entities from other realms. Incidentally, Kalawa always compares ilinks to both shamanic activity and carnival rides. He thinks that they're kind of in the middle place. And it's sort of funny, you can look at kind of vertigo games that children play at parties, Bloody Mary, Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board. Some of these have been collected in games to play in the dark, a guide to summoning spirit, divining the future, and invoking the supernatural. And this is maybe in the middle of my Ouroboros, the place where kind of games influenced by the occult and playful occult practice kind of come together in the process of disorientation. And the immediate context for both Grant and Chumbley is the notion of the left-hand path derived from Saivite understandings of Tantric Hinduism. And what ends up being sort of referenced in these vertigo games for spirit contact is the notion of Lila, or sacred play. So there's a great kind of monograph on this by David R. Kinsley called The Divine Player. And so Lila means divine play. And essentially the notion is that because the Hindu gods are totally other, they're not obligated to do anything. They don't have to work. They don't have to fight or go to war. And so therefore all of their actions are voluntary and spontaneous, characteristics which Kinsley, citing Huizinga in support, identifies as fundamental to play. As Kinsley writes, the spontaneous and superfluous nature of play is eminently appropriate to express the freedom of the gods. And in fact, that freedom can be so intense that it's anarchical. Kinsley specifically talks about the anarchical Lila of Shiva, who's playing out in the smashan, in the burning grounds for cremation. But that play can also be an erotic love play between Krishna and his consort Radha, wherein the apparent separation of the participants is Maya, but all are contained within one Godhead. And Grant explicitly refers to the Lila of Krishna and Radha in his Typhonian trilogies, where he refers to the divine play of consciousness as the game of hide and seek, which Krishna, pure consciousness, perpetually plays with his consort Radha, herself the form of Maya. At the heart of the sorcerer's Lila, and therefore playful occultism, is the concept of negative existence and the negatively existent ones, phrases which haunt both Grant's writing and Chumbley's, as well as the convergence of them in the joint Sabbatic Typhonian Lodge Kusevitu. In Grant, magic involves evoking and invoking entities that are non-existent, but somehow real. Indeed, these entities are non-manifestations or an unmanifestation of the one true reality, accessible only by negating the phenomenal world. Grant writes, the initiates, the Gnostics knew perhaps intuitively that reality lay somewhere beyond or behind the total negation of this glamour. And Grant ends up arguing late in the Typhonian trilogies and outside the circles of time that the only entities that are non-existent but have being are outside of time, and the only way that something can have being outside of time is for it to exist in the mauve zone, a liminal interdimensional space between sleeping and waking. And these concepts of kind of intermediate dream realms in which we play with entities that are that have being but do not exist in space and time absolutely pervades the work of Grant and Chumbley, and it's to some extent preceded by the work of Austin Osman Spare. So there's a wonderful 4-volume trilogy by Ian C. Edwards called Being and Non-Being in Occult Experience. And one of the things that Ian C. Edwards ends up saying is that the magical practitioner works at the crossroads of being, non-being, and becoming. And in the 4th volume of his work dedicated to Chumbley, Edwards speaks of self-emerging from the becomingness of otherness as revealed through play, parentheses, Lila, of logos and alogos, being and non-being. Edwards argues that such systems abide in an ongoing flux of signification in which orientation and disorientation, quote, are in a constant state of play, where words play with other words and play with the reader. He even goes so far as to claim that in such systems, ideas and practices are not so much tools, but toys. For Edwards, the magical play of the sorcerer's Lila occurs under the sign of the chiasmus, the X, the rhetorical figure embodied by the Greek chi, or Roman letter X, with an additional horizontal line through the center of the X, and all surrounded by an Ouroboros, representing the serpentine sorceress self of magic. Edwards writes, the nullpunkt stands at the center, at the 0 point, at the crossroads of non-being, becoming, and being. The practice of sorcery encompasses greater spaces of inclusion, so that the movement is from the 0 point outward, gradually including the spaces between. The most haunting and sorcerous magical play takes place at precisely this 0 point, which also lies in the center of our Ouroboros, where games and magical play overlap, fuse, and become one. The Ouija board, which this talk began with as its title image, is the symbol of playful occultism par excellence, existing or non-existing or negatively existing as it does at the crossroads of the material and the immaterial, wooden planchette and immaterial spirit, spiritualist tool and mass-manufactured game. So the history of the Ouija board kind of originates in spiritualist table wrapping, or maybe, more accurately, a spiritualist table tilting. So this was the idea that you would go to the seance and the table would tilt around to indicate different layers of letters of the alphabet. And so this planchette and this board become just a more convenient way to spell out messages from the spirit world. And the classic motto of the 1966 mass-produced Ouija board by Parker Brothers, when the Ouija board explicitly becomes manufactured by a game company, reads, "It's only a game, isn't it? Isn't it?" The rhetorical ambiguities of this slogan encapsulate playful occultism, which first negates its own status as genuine occultist artifact, only a game, but then partially calls into question this negation. And similarly, Grant and Chumley describe the forces they evoke as negatively existing, not real in the sense of existing within the illusory phenomena of time and space, which is all Maya, but more than real or surreal in the sense of being outside of time and space, at the crossroads, within and beyond the mauve zone. I don't really have time to go into the case study of Wraith the Oblivion. What I will say is that, like a lot of tabletop role-playing games, it has a disclaimer at the beginning which says that all mystical and supernatural elements are fiction and intended for entertainment purposes. It also contains an afterwards in the second edition which states, "Wraith is cursed. There's no other way to say it." And I know people who have worked on Wraith, and they basically say, if the Wraith curse is an invention, then there's a lot of coincidences that somebody's going to have to explain. All right, got 3 more minutes, so I think I can bring it home now, and we can do some Q&A. Recognizing the ontological playfulness of occultism liberates magical practice from excessive gravitas that can emerge from being excessively attached to the illusory glamour of the phenomenal world, thus protecting practitioners from the potentially self-destructive effects of dealing with dark forces while also allowing for depth. Similarly, playful occultism prevents the monomania and inherent ethical risk of change through will, and allows for the spontaneous emergence of synchronicity and spirit contact, tangential tantra, reflected in the practice of Grant and Chumley. And here I'm thinking about the way that devotees of Thelema, Aleister Crowley's system, can often accumulate a sense of monomaniacal focus, which leads to obsession and can sometimes really damage people's lives. So, Jack Parsons literally blows himself up, or someone else does. Frederick Todd becomes obsessed with being Crowley's magical child and deciphering the cipher puzzle. And Lady Frida Harris says that Thelema feels like a schoolmistress dressed in white who follows me around and tells me what to do, even though that practice is supposed to kind of liberate. And we can look at kind of the left-hand path of theistic Satanism and see that it often dead ends for some of its black metal devotees. That there's an awful lot of murder and suicide that kind of swirls around those traditions. But in contrast, I'd like to point at this gentleman, Aidan Wachter, whose approach to magic in weaving fate involves shuttling between the multiple threads of one's individual fate within a network of animistic interrelationship that Wachter calls the field, with an associated hyper-sigil-based journal practice, which he explicitly compares to a game. He says, we are playing a game with time and synchronicity and fate. The trick is restoring the sense of play without trivializing magic, echoing Nietzsche's classic aphorism, man's maturity to have regained the seriousness that he had as a child at play. Maturity in occultism can flow from connecting with the current of sorceress Lila, where the magical practitioner becomes as serious as a child at play. And there we go. There's my references.